the Video Essay Podcast, a show featuring conversations with leading practitioners of videographic criticism. I'm your host, Will DeGravio, and on today's show, I sit down with one of the best, and at least in my humble opinion, video essayists currently working on YouTube today, and that is Mr. Thomas Flight. We get into it all. Thomas's origin story, how he became a full-time video essayist. We also dive in deep into a video essay of his on religion in the films of Martin Scorsese, and a video essay by another fantastic YouTube video essayist, Jacob Geller. Now, before I share my conversation with Thomas with all of you, I just want to remind you to please subscribe and follow the podcast on our various social media channels. We are on YouTube, on Twitter at The Video Essay. You can follow us on Facebook, The Video Essay Podcast. And please also consider subscribing to the show on iTunes and Spotify and leaving a rating and a review if possible. I'd also like to remind you to please subscribe to the podcast's regular newsletter. Right now, I'm averaging one newsletter every other week or so. Notes on videographic criticism, which you can find at thevideoessay.substack.com. I know it's been a while. Thank you all for being patient with me as I get a new episode out here into the world. I'm hoping to perhaps release one more episode by the end of the year, but that's a little bit up in the air right now, so I don't want to make any promises that I can't keep. So if this is the final podcast of the year, I just want to wish you all a safe and happy holiday season, a wonderful new year, and to just say how grateful and thankful I am to be a member of the video essay community, and for all of you in how supportive you are of me, of the show, of the work that I do. It does not go unnoticed, and it's incredibly appreciated. And I feel so grateful to be associated with everyone who listens to the show and who shares and comments online. It really is, I enjoy nothing else more. So I just wanted to say thank you all. I'm grateful. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Thomas Flight. And now I am very pleased to welcome onto the show Thomas Flight. I am sure everyone listening right now is familiar with Thomas's videos. Has hundreds of thousands of subscribers on YouTube, is constantly making some of the, at least my favorite work out there. And I think, Thomas, I had reached out to you, who even knows, in the pandemic time, but I feel like it might have been over a year ago, being like, we need to sit down for the podcast. And then like, I don't know what, like, I feel like sometimes when I send a message out like that, it's like crazy how time just, especially during a pandemic. So I'm so happy to finally get to ask you all the questions and talk to you here today. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, hello. It's great. It's great to be here, and I'm glad we're finally getting to chat. I've been enjoying the podcast and your newsletter, and I love that you're doing the work of kind of documenting this space and talking to people and helping kind of further this form that I think is really cool. So I'm excited to chat.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, it's funny because when I think about my own background into this work, I think I primarily came through it, as people may know, through like the more academic realm and on Vimeo, but your videos were some of, like, I wasn't watching a ton of YouTube video essayists when I first started getting interested in this, which is kind of funny to think about in hindsight, but your videos were some of the few that I was aware of and watching. I don't know how I came across them, but I know that to be true. And so I'm curious, what is your introduction to the form? What's your origin story? How are you first introduced to video essays, and then what inspired you to start making them yourself?
Yeah, my first introduction to video essays, I think, was a series of videos by the critic Matt Zoller-Seitz, who's one of my favorites. He did a series on Wes Anderson. It was called the Wes Anderson Collection. It was kind of some videographic work that predated his book, the Wes Anderson Collection. And I'm not sure. I think they're still available online somewhere. They're kind of hard to find. But I had like just found. I was like early 20s, or I was kind of getting back into film, and I had just kind of discovered Wes Anderson and was really intrigued by it, and then found this series of videos, and I was like, this is amazing. It blew my mind. I was like, it makes so much sense to talk about movies using a visual form, because you can just show what you're talking about. And that kind of stuck in my head. And then I think it was maybe a year or two after that, I came across Every Frame of Painting, and it was same thing. I was just like, oh, there is a lot of potential here. And I was a huge fan of Tony's videos for years. And then eventually a few more essayists kind of came onto the scene, Nerdwriter and Michael at Lessons from a Screenplay. And I was watching these, and I was an editor at the time. I was working for a commercial production company, and I was just into film from the filmmaking side, into cinematography and editing, and was just kind of I was into movies, but that was almost secondary. And I just had a moment where I was like, I could make one of these videos. And I had been thinking about, Nightcrawler for a while and had stuff that I wanted to say about it. And so I made one, and I just like uploaded it to YouTube because I was like, it's got to go somewhere. And people watched that one. And so I was like, oh, I'll make another one. And I, did that, and I never stopped. So 100 videos, and like 4 years later, here we are.
I love that. And I think you're not alone in citing Matt Zoller Seitz as like an early influence. I think he's such an interesting figure, and someone I would definitely love to try and talk to at some point. I have a million questions. As far as I think someone who kind of sits in the videographic world and also the non-videographic world in a really great, interesting way, and that kind of brings people in. And I love this idea of like, it's just so funny doing these interviews about how like all of these origin stories, like there's so much, there's like a Venn diagram of all these similarities, and that you just had this thought rolling around in your head, and you're like, how do I get that out there? And it kind of sounds like with your editing background, perhaps would you have ever thought to like sit down and write a written article about this? Or was it thinking like, oh, I have this editing background, this film background, so therefore I'm more comfortable, approaching the material in this way? Did that have anything to do with it, do you think?
When I started out doing video essays, the thought of like writing about film was just like nowhere in my mind. So I do write about film now. I have a newsletter that I write for, and I think like I tried to practice that a little bit more on its own and find value in that. But yeah, I definitely I did not see myself as a writer then, and writing about film was not on my radar. But editing and recording voiceover were things that, I was already doing, and I felt like I had enough skills to sort of weave this narrative. A lot of the editing I was doing at the time was like taking long form interviews and kind of paring them down to like 2 minutes and crafting a narrative out of that. And so the leap from that to like taking a 2-hour film and sort of like adding a little voiceover and kind of turning that into this like story was it wasn't that much of a leap, to kind of make that jump. So, yeah. So writing, no, I wasn't thinking about it in that way at all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what you're describing, I think, really resonates with me. And, I've had two of my professors that I had in college, Jason Mattel and Christian Keithley, who do this kind of work. And they kind of talk about like, when they teach their video essay class, the film production students, it's often sometimes the first time that they feel comfortable, or perhaps it's a place where they can really shine in their critical studies. But then the critical studies students, that was me in college, who I was like, I can't go near like a camera. Like I was like, what is happening? I was like, oh, this actually is like an accessible way for me to kind of play around and kind of be like, oh, this is how a film works. Let me pick it apart.
I was just going to say, like, I often get the question, people ask me about how I go about analyzing things, and I'm sure we might get into that a little bit more later. But like, that's often something I tell people is just like the very process of making a video essay, like having to pull the footage into an editor and like recontextualizing it in a different space is like a big part of process of that criticism for me, or doing that. And I think it's such a valuable thing, even for people who don't, may not have the goal of like producing works that they're going to publish somewhere. Just doing that process is such a valuable way, I think, to like examine a piece of media or work or something.
I totally agree. And I think, I've actually, it's funny you say that, because I've thought about that before, where I'm like, even if you want to be, the next, Roger Ebert or whoever and be like a written film critic. I think on some level you should be engaging with this kind of work because you're inevitably going to get something out of it. Just like I think if you're a video, you write, a lot of video essayists also write, like that also helps inform, there's really a symbiotic relationship between the two. And I think as editing technologies become more and more accessible, and there's obviously still barriers there, but more and more we're seeing that. I think there's really no reason to at least dip your toe every once in a while. And I always think that's fun when I see on Twitter, like some film critic I follow, and they're like, my first video essay or my first little experiment or whatever. It's very fun. But one thing you mentioned was kind of this. One thing I'm interested in when it comes to this kind of thing is thinking about accessibility, right? Like what's great is that you were able to take that first video and just upload it straight to YouTube, right? Whereas like you couldn't email, if you were like this Mindhunter take or, this take on Citizen Kane or whatever, like you couldn't just necessarily email the editor at IndieWire and just expect that it could be up on the site the next day with a freelance pitch, right? And so how much of that was a factor to you? And when did you start to begin to take YouTube seriously beyond just a platform where you could easily upload your thoughts and work?
I definitely had in the back of my mind that it could be a serious thing a little bit from the beginning. Like I had seen Michael at Lessons from the Screenplay, especially. He was doing like one video a month. And I think right around when I started, he was like 9 months in, and he had gone from 0 to like 100,000 subscribers in those 9 months. And I was like, oh, wow, you like at a rate of output that's like fairly sustainable. I wouldn't have to be making because most of what I was familiar with YouTube at that time was people who were just like pumping out videos daily or weekly or whatever. And that's what I assumed you had to do to get anywhere on the site. So I saw him especially. I was like, he kind of grew pretty quickly just, putting out one video a month, which I now know putting out one video a month just is still quite a bit of effort and work. But at the moment I was like, oh yeah, like success on YouTube. That was kind of the moment where I thought success on YouTube is attainable. I didn't really have the expectation that I was going to get there when I started, or that it was going to turn into something. I had a full-time job. I was working at a video production company. I was happy with that. At the time, it was just kind of a hobby. But it was pretty, I think it was I don't remember what number video, but it was about 6 months in, I had a video that kind of blew up for the first time. I made a video that was there was no voiceover. It was just a comparison of footage from the television show Mindhunter to real documentary footage of the character that the actor in the show was playing. And I just took the two and combined them and overlapped them and a little bit. And I uploaded that and it went a little viral. It ended up with over 1 million views. And that was the moment where I was like, oh, this might be going somewhere. And then I became a little bit more dedicated to trying to pursue growth and stuff. But I really just kind of eased into it. Even the transition from, working my day job to full time, it was I ended up losing that job and then just kind of drifted in this liminal space for months, and then ended up doing YouTube full time. So there was never a moment where I was I'm going to be a YouTuber, and then that's what I went for. It just kind of slowly happened over 2 or 3 years. So much there I want to follow up on. First, I think it's just a great lesson out there, or just it's fun to hear that the video that kind of, in a sense, I guess, launched you or made you have this epiphany or whatever is really that, I haven't seen that video. I'll have to go back and watch it. But this kind of what you described just seems and I mean this lovingly and beautifully, kind of the most basic video essay rhetoric that we think of, right? The side-by-side comparison or whatever. And it's kind of a great reminder that if you're listening to this or out there, and you don't need to have this crazy editing background or anything to make work that resonates with people, that people find compelling. And that's one of the most beautiful things about it. No, that's That's great. I would love to just throw that out there, especially speaking to people who are considering doing this. Like, I think the video essay space right now is a little different than it was when I got into it. But it's easy to look at the people who are doing these like epic, like, you know, hour-long exposés and like on YouTube, like diving into stuff and doing these really well-researched. All that stuff is phenomenal. But yeah, you still can just kind of get pretty far like that. I just watched that show and then I noticed that there was this other footage out here and I was like, oh, I would be interested in just seeing a video where those two things were side by side. So I didn't have to like, you know, press play on one and then pause on the other. And I just did everybody else the service of that. And that's where, you know, that's where things came from. So I was just willing to, you know, put out there the things that I was interested in seeing, I think. And it can start that simply. You don't have to like get into this really intense space, I think, to start out.
One question that I have that perhaps pertains more to the work that you're doing now and your current status as a YouTuber, it relates to audience. You mentioned that when you were watching Every Film or Paintings video, Lesson from the Screenplays video, you noticed that he was putting out about a video every month or so. And I would imagine that, you know, on one hand might be a school of thought that you should put out as many videos as you possibly can all the time. But if like a film director did that, we might think like, wait, like, hold on a second, like give us your best stuff once a year or, you know, once every 5 years. We don't need a new movie every year, every few months or something. And so how do you strike that balance between not overloading your audience with content and making sure that you give them kind of the perfect amount? And what is your sense that the perfect amount is, at least for as it relates to your channel and your audience?
When I was starting out, I was doing a video once a month because I was doing other things on the side, but also it was just kind of like once a month, and when I had an idea that I felt like was worth doing, and then once I got into the space where it was like, okay, this is my full-time job, I'm having to take this a little bit more seriously because it's starting to like pay the bills. I settled into a little bit more of a set schedule, and that was basically just based on like scaling up the amount of work I was doing. I was like, well, I can do one of these a month if I'm working at like a part-time job on top of what I'm already doing. So if I'm doing just that, I can do 2 a month as a reasonable space to be in. So that's kind of where I set it. And then I've stuck to that more or less as a schedule. And my thought, to be honest, at that point was more about what is sustainable for me rather than thinking about what my audience wanted. I'm definitely in a space now where there's upsides and downsides to that maintaining that kind of schedule. There's a sense in which like the work as a whole is a practice, and there have been times where it's just been really valuable for me to be like, I'm just going to put something out every 2 weeks, and like, you know, I don't get stuck stewing in sort of an idea forever, just like, you know, waiting. You know, there's times where I find that practice of just being like, make something and publish it really beneficial. But then there are other times where I'm like, I don't have the time to like focus on an idea as long as I would want to. And so I am kind of right now in a transitional mode where I'm moving more towards a space of like giving myself a little bit more flexibility and time between videos so that I can just focus on publishing something really when I feel like I have something worthwhile, or just giving myself a little bit of wiggle room in between. Because I do think, you know, ultimately in terms of success on YouTube in this space, and this is how it would relate to the audience, like I think people will appreciate consistent quality at an inconsistent publishing schedule more so than they would consistent publishing and inconsistent quality. That's not true. I should be clear. I don't think that's true of YouTube as a whole. It really depends on what kind of creator you are. Like there is a space on YouTube where, you know, just putting something out regularly is valuable because it's less about the content. It's more about like a parasocial relationship or something. But I think in the specific space that I'm in, and that probably a lot of your listeners would be in, you know, quality is gonna matter more. And sorry if this is too much, but one last addendum I'll add on to that is that I don't really think about my audience as being like a single, like a very unified group of people, because the unfortunate reality is that it's not often. It's a very sort of transient mass that, the YouTube algorithm is sort of selecting, and there's a core group that is going to be the people who are like, I'm going to watch every Thomas Flight video, but that's a pretty small, compared to the, hundreds of thousands of subscribers I have, that's probably like 10,000 people or something like that, which is, that's great. That's a lot, granted, but like, that's not the majority. Most people watching my videos are like just somebody who's like, I'm interested in this topic, and the algorithm found them a video about that, and my video happened to be that. So I definitely think about my work in terms of its relationship to a specific audience, but I definitely also have to keep in mind, like, what's the audience for this specific video that YouTube is going to find, and kind of having to rethink that every time.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate that, and I assure you that I and the audience loves the wonkiness of it. So don't hold back, because it's fascinating. Because I honestly can't, I can't imagine being a full-time video essayist. Like it sounds like incredibly. Obviously it sounds great in many ways, but also sounds incredibly stressful. Because I think, to your point, sometimes I feel like with this form, and you get so wrapped up in an idea, and you develop this, like you're playing around the editing platform. You just want to keep going. And then you're like, oh, I have a deadline. And so for the academic video essayists, like they can kind of play around, but because that's not their main job, or if you're just doing it part-time, or if you're like me, who like just plays around with stuff when I'm like bored one night or something, but for you, it's like you have deadlines and things like that. We talk about the YouTube algorithm whenever there's a YouTube video essayist on the show. So it sounds like, thinking that informs how you think about your audience, but how does it also shape the topics of the videos themselves? Like, it seems like you have a mix of videos that are just like something that's rolling around in your head and that you can't think, but I imagine you also try to make videos that are, responding to recent films or films that are in the news or anniversaries or times of the year or something like that. So how do those external factors, namely the algorithm itself, shape the topics that you select to cover?
They definitely do, unfortunately, more so than I would like sometimes. And sometimes I feel like I'm kind of playing two roles or working two jobs, where it's like there's the work that I want to be doing or the work that I'm trying to do because it's fulfilling and interesting to me. And then there's like the job I have, which is, I think the situation that a lot of people are in a lot of different contexts. Like there's always like the work you're trying to do, and then the context within which that work is situated. And there's always pros and cons to different contexts. But one of the big parts of the context of doing work on YouTube is, the algorithm. And I know, for example, that if I put out a video about a film or a television show that people are talking about or searching for or thinking about, it's just going to do better than if I'm talking about like, an obscure Russian film from 40 years ago. So that definitely informs how I approach things. But I try to find a balance there. I think one thing that I've been getting better at is finding ways of like framing things I want to talk about and I care about and am passionate about within a context that will like appeal to people, and that the algorithm will kind of like go with. And some of that comes down to even just how you frame it with a thumbnail and, a title. But then other times that has to do with like, sometimes it's like one for them, one for me. And then sometimes it's just about like sneaking things I want to talk about into a context that is a little bit more popular. I just made a video about the TV show Succession. And like I talked about Thomas Vinterberg's Festin in there from the Dogma 95 movement, and Camera Person, which is one of my favorite documentaries. And they're related to the video, but like, it's like, those aren't things I would, if I just made a video about those two films, it probably wouldn't do that well, but I can contextualize that within talking about a current show that's doing pretty well, and maybe even introduce my audience to some things that they wouldn't have found otherwise. So yeah, it's a tough balance. It definitely plays a role. And basically my approach is, what can I get away with? Like, how much can I get away with in terms of talking about what I want to talk about while I still manage to like pay rent and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as you're talking about this now, and this is not something I had thought about before, so I'm totally inarticulate. I apologize, but it what you're talking about kind of almost reminds me of the job of kind of the daily film critic in a sense. You know, in talking with someone like Adrian Martin on this show, he has described about how, you know, when he was writing film reviews, he would drop in references to perhaps older or more obscure films, hoping that the audience may be exposed to them for the first time, or perhaps they encounter the name of this director over and over again, and they finally say, you know what, I'm gonna go check them out. But that's not the main point of the essay. And I'm also thinking about, you know, there are film critics who review films on a daily basis because that's their job, right? But then they might publish a longer book, you know, on a certain topic or film where they can really get into things. So in a sense, it's almost like their first draft. You know, I know you made a lot of videos around like Parasite and The Irishman in 2019. And so perhaps maybe 5 years from now, you'll revisit them and deliver a more final take on them, as it were. But what I remember that I really enjoyed was you had a video on how The Irishman builds on Goodfellas. And I think you released it like in December of 2019, like around the time The Irishman came out, if I remember correctly. And it was just such a great example because I had just seen the film. I was like, oh, this is amazing, blah, blah. And then I watched your video. I was like, oh, this is great. Like, this is awesome. So was that like an example of you trying to meet the discourse? And what is like, could you just take us inside the process generally of like, how does your process differ when you're trying to create those maybe more quick turnaround type videos?
I mean, in that case, I'll use that as an example. I mean, it was just like, I watched The Irishman and immediately I was like, oh, this is a fascinating like recontextualization of Goodfellas. And so the wheels just immediately started spinning and I was like, let me just I don't think I even had a script. I was just like, let me just put Goodfellas and The Irishman like together and in Premiere Pro and just see what it looks like and start there. And so I did that. And I think it even like comes out to like the running time, you know, Goodfellas kind of ends right around where like that crazy third act of The Irishman kicks in. That just sort of like is this, you know, postmortem on like Martin Scorsese's entire, you know, gangster over or whatever. And so, I mean, that one kind of more organically came from just like me being really excited about a film that I was interested in right as it was coming out. Sometimes it is a little bit more, you know, and then I know in that moment, I'm like, other people are going to be into this because, you know, it's people are talking about it now. Sometimes it's a little bit more calculated. Like the video I just put out, I was like, I knew Succession was coming back and I was like, you know, I want to do something about Succession. What can I say about that? How do I, so, you know, there are things like that. Like I have like been watching, there's some shows I've been watching like Barry, for example, where I'm like, in the last couple seasons of that, I was like, I want to do a video about this, or maybe Atlanta is another good example. And so I know in the back of my head, I know I'm going to revisit that. I'm going to talk about that at some point, but I basically like shelved those because I know if I do that right when the new season is coming out, the timing of it, people are going to be looking for it. People are going to be talking about it, thinking about it. So the timing of that is going to be more important. And so sometimes it's just a matter of like, I know I want to talk about something, but just, you know, timing that with, say, the Oscars, you know, if the film's been nominated or something, timing it with the Oscars instead of like right when the film is released.
What you're saying there, just thinking again here, is you really capture something that's such a key difference between television and film for being the video essayist, in that you kind of know if you want to talk about season 2 of a show, it sounds like what you're saying is, you know, you have more time because it can still be relevant when season 3 comes out. And, you know, maybe you could talk about silence when The Irishman comes out, but it doesn't really work that way for film, because maybe some people don't think of them as aren't so like auteurist and they're thinking about like directors or what have you, or the topics. I'm sure there's a ton of people who want to see the Martin Scorsese gangster film, but are like, silence, like, and we're going to talk about this later, but like silence, like, not interested in that, so that's super interesting. That's kind of sounds like, am I hearing you correctly there?
Yeah, with film, a little bit more the way it works would be like, I would try to like see if I know it's a film I'm probably going to be interested in, or I try to keep up to date on like new releases, the ones I'm interested in, and I'll see it in theaters, and then less anymore because now things are dropping simultaneously or whatever. But I'd see it in theaters and I'd kind of get a sense of like, oh, I might have something to say about this. And then I'll kind of have that on the back burner and be like, oh, eventually this is going to hit like streaming or come out on Blu-ray or whatever. And that'll be the moment when I can finally kind of examine it. And but I'll be prepared for that. And ultimately, I think I do work pretty fast, and I work pretty like close to my deadlines usually. Like I'm not working like weeks or months out ahead in terms of release schedules, which is insanely stressful sometimes. But the benefit of that is like when something drops and I want to talk about it and I have something to say about it, I can generally like get that out there pretty fast. And that has its downsides, but that also sometimes exposes work to, when you're able to ride that sort of wave of when people are thinking about stuff or right after they watch stuff, it exposes people to work that, maybe they wouldn't bother to watch, if it's like months or years after they watch something for the first time.
One thing you just said that relates directly to the next question that I was going to ask you is I remember when I watched your video essay on, The Irishman builds on Goodfellas. I think it was the first time I realized like, whoa, if these movies are going to start just dropping on Netflix like this and not go through these long theatrical releases and then we wait for the Blu-ray or what have you, that really changes the game for the video essayist because you just have direct access to this material. And I imagine during the pandemic, now that this is, as you said, happening, it's basically the new norm. Has that just kind of changed the way you think about the types of materials that you can work with?
Yeah, it definitely does. It shortens that timeline. I mean, there's so much hype around Dune, which drops today, and it's like it's hitting theaters today, and it's up on HBO Max today, and so it's like I'm going to see it tonight, and then if I want to start working on a video essay about it tomorrow morning, I can do that, and that definitely changes things. I don't know if it's for the better, but it's a little bit of a different space. I kind of did like having that room to like see something in theaters and then like, let it ruminate on it for a little while, before I started working on something. So yeah, but there's also an accessibility there and an immediacy that I think has its upsides. So we'll see if it's better in the long run, how it plays out. But it's definitely changing. The whole thing is changing, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, one thing I'd be interested to know is and see as this changes is I think a lot of times I'll because of that window that's existed in the past, I'll almost when a video essay drops about Portrait of a Lady on Fire, like several months after it comes out or whatever, I'll almost use it as a way to rewatch the film in a sense and to just kind of be reminded of certain things, because video essays are pretty good at like giving you the quick summary or like a lot of extra, just a lot of different shots and ways to see things. And I wonder if that will change if, as you say, like now the turnaround time for Dune is right away. Like, are you assuming the film is just fresh in everyone's minds now and your script doesn't need to, contain certain things or certain images?
Yeah. It definitely could impact the way you construct or formulate a video. And I think about that in terms of like, I always have that in mind when I'm talking about older stuff or stuff that was out years ago. Like often you have to like couch that in a lot more context. Whereas like if I'm dropping something in the midst of like a show that's ongoing or, right after a film happened, it's a little bit more like the audience I'm imagining is somebody who like, just watched it. So they're coming fresh out of that. And this is almost like more like a DVD bonus, that they're like watching right after they, watch the film or something. So they're different modes. And I think they kind of serve somewhat different purposes, but hopefully, people get something out of both of those.
Yeah. One final question I have for you here before we pivot to talking more about Scorsese and kind of what we've been talking about is obviously there was news recently that David Fincher is releasing a series of visual essays, I think he calls them, and every frame of painting is involved in this, and these are for Netflix. If I remember correctly, you've made video essays for Netflix in the past. Is that correct?
None. Yes, that is. I was hired by Netflix to make some for the Netflix UK YouTube channel, and then they also hosted some of them on their Facebook page. But I never made any that were for like distribution on the Netflix platform directly. It was more like they, as a marketing effort, wanted YouTube or Facebook videos, where it was me kind of guest essaying about, one of their shows or something. So yeah, I did a few, I think 3, a little while ago, but yeah. And, I don't know how much you can divulge or how much you're comfortable sharing, but I'd just be kind of curious to hear your thoughts, on kind of the Fincher news. I know we still don't know a lot about it. And what is your sense? Do you think Netflix in the future could be a home for this kind of work for those, I'm thinking about now just because you kind of likened your videos to Blu-ray or DVD commentaries. And so, I'd like to think that perhaps maybe Netflix will begin hosting video essays or commissioning people to make them. Do you get the sense that maybe that's something they're interested in? Do you have no idea? Would you like to see it? What are your thoughts generally on all of that? I love it. I think I love anything that brings the form more exposure and notoriety is great. I love video essay as a form. In both its more academic context and its more popular context on YouTube and in other places, and so I think it's a great way to explore things, and so I'm excited that YouTube or Netflix is moving into that space, and I hope we see more of that kind of thing. I don't really see any downside to it. So yeah, I'm super curious to see what that series is going to entail, and I'm excited to get to see more work. I know Tony he's done some like Criterion extras and stuff like that, but I'm excited to see more of his stuff. Yeah, I'm very fascinated. I have a lot of thoughts about it just as we figure out what's going on, and that is my hope too. Kind of the rising tide. I always get this wrong. Rising tide lifts all boats. Yeah, raises all boats. Yeah. So hopefully that maybe this Fincher project with Airbending is the beginning of that tide. And I think I'm going to share some thoughts on this in my newsletter. I'll plug it here, thevideoessay.substack.com, with the huge caveat that we still don't know a lot of what's going to happen. But I'll share my take. Why not? So let's now transition to talking about a video essay by you in some more detail, and we'll just continue on the Scorsese train because why not? We love him. I also think if Scorsese was like in his 20s today, he'd definitely be making video essays. Like I think that's it's a no-brainer. And so the first basic question, and the assumption here is for the listeners that you will have already watched this video. So I would encourage you, if you can, to, if you haven't yet, maybe pause here, go watch it, and then come back. But I think you'll gain a lot from this conversation either way. But that is the idea of this podcast, is that you have a little bit of homework. So first, just a basic question. How did this video essay come into being, and what was your creative process like for it? I think when we were talking about videos that we might like to discuss, you mentioned that there was a lot of research that went into this piece, and I think that's pretty evident when you watch it. So I'd be curious for you to kind of give us just a condensed timeline of how you made it. So this video is a good kind of counterpoint to some of the stuff I was talking about earlier about, working really fast and getting stuff out in a timely manner. And, because this was definitely not that. This was a video, what sparked the idea in my mind was, I've been aware of Scorsese's work for a long time, obviously, and have been a fan. But when when The Irishman came out, I realized it made me realize how central of a theme sort of redemption and religion are in his work. I was like, oh, this is actually much more. It seemed evident to me through The Irishman that it was actually much more important to him as a filmmaker than I had previously assumed or imagined. And so that kind of started the wheels turning and was a lens through which I just began thinking about Scorsese's work in a different way. And I just kind of stewed on that. I had the idea for this movie or this video, and it was kind of formulated in my mind as like Martin Scorsese's search for redemption. And there was a few films that I had in mind specifically that I knew touched on those themes. And I just started sort of revisiting some of his movies, and I was thinking about that, as you mentioned earlier, the Irishman video I put out in December of 2019, and I just released this new video this summer. So for about a year and a half, it just kind of like the idea just cooked in my head. And I tell my patrons about what I'm working on in the future. And so there was this, I was just like telling them, I'm going to do the Scorsese video. And then it would be like, it was such a big monolithic project that I just like kept kicking the can down the road because I knew it was going to involve watching a bunch of films, rewatching a bunch of stuff that I had already seen. And so I just kind of like kept kicking it down the road, kept stewing on it, marinating on it. And then eventually like I had a moment where I had a little bit of extra time to work on a video. And I was like, okay, this is it. I'm just going to go for it. So yeah, there was like a year-long like gestation process that happened prior to this video coming about.
Yeah. And, obviously we talked about another Scorsese video that you made. Obviously Scorsese, top 5 director, top 1, top best living director, whatever. But what is it about his work that you are drawn to? And specifically as a video essayist, because I personally feel, and I'm not going to name names, but there are directors in films that I love and really care about, but that I don't think I would ever want to work with in this form, in this way. And I don't really, if I'm being honest, I haven't really like thought about it a lot and explored it. I would like to someday more, and perhaps you'll give me a really good answer here that will help me shape the way that I think about it. But I guess, do you agree with that premise that perhaps there are some movies or directors or actors or whoever that are just better or that we're more drawn to in this kind of work? And if so, is there something about Scorsese for you that makes you want to play around with his films in this way?
I definitely agree with the sentiment that there are some people who, I don't want to approach in this form, and for varying reasons. Like, it's different for different people. Sometimes it's just like I more recently made a video about David Lynch, and like I finally kind of found an angle by which I felt comfortable talking about his work, but like if you watch that video, it's basically like, I'm not going to explain David Lynch to you is kind of the thesis of that video. So it's like, there's certain directors like him that I'm like, you're almost doing the material a disservice by trying to like approach it in a certain manner, or at least the way that, I would normally. So there are definitely people that I feel that resistance for, varying reasons. Or like sometimes there's just movies or directors where it's like, it's almost too personal, and it like, I don't feel like I understand it enough, or it like affects me almost too much for me to have this like more analytic remove that I think is sometimes necessary for this kind of analysis. But Scorsese, and one of the things that attracted me to his work, but also this topic in this video, is I'm very fascinated in the connection between like form, how a filmmaker is using form, and like what they're trying to say, and when they're using like actual like technical form, like camera movement, editing, cinematography, like all these things to communicate their themes. And that's something that I think is a big part of Scorsese's work. And then I'm also interested in like the story of a body of work. I guess sort of that kind of auteur theory, I feel like has gotten mangled by a lot of auteur theory has gotten a bit mangled in that people tend to like hone in on like it's about the director just being this perfect, holy, like, you know, conveyance of a vision or something. But I love the somewhat slightly different conception of like examining the body of work and the story of like what is that director sort of saying, perhaps even unconsciously, like over the course of, you know, a lifetime. And Scorsese is a fascinating one to examine in that way because his work, he's been working for so long, so prolifically, and he's touched on so many different, you know, his work is very diverse. So you have, you know, Wolf of Wall Street, Hugo, and Silence. And it's like, I couldn't think of 3, you know, different films, but if you put those together, you know, there's some kind of connection I think you could see in all of those. And that's not the end all be all, but it's a fascinating route of examination for me. So yeah, he's also a director who's, you can't remove him from his, I mean, you can't with any director, but especially Scorsese, you can't remove him from his context in like film. Like he's so connected to like all of his influences because he has such a broad influence. He found so much influence in world cinema, and then he's gone on to influence so many people throughout his career. And so he's uniquely positioned like in between like his influences and the people he's influenced. And that stuff is also fascinating to me. One last thing I'll say is that I'm really fascinated by where religion and art kind of intersect, because I see film, cinema as an art form, and religion as both as in their best forms as ways of like communicating ideas that are sort of like beyond language. And so I think it's really fascinating to look at like where those two things kind of converge. And like I talk about in this video, that's a very at least central part of, I think, Scorsese's career and his filmmaking. So that was like 11 different ideas, I think, shotgunned out at once. But hopefully that answers the question.
I appreciate that tremendously, and a lot for us to unpack there, which is great. You know, it's funny, we go back to Matt Zoller Seitz. I think he tweeted the other day, he like quote tweeted Tarantino giving that quote that he always gives where like, you know, when they ask him about like 10 films or whatever, and he's like, directors get worse when they get older. And it's just, like, just no, but like, and obviously like, you know, we could cite 1,000 examples, but Scorsese would probably be like right at the top. And I think what your video does such a great job of doing, and I think this is like one thing that the form of the video essay is really good for, is looking across bodies of work in kind of in a condensed kind of way. And I mean that in like the best possible sense. You know, it can do it very quickly, just a few images, boom, 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 boom. And you're kind of, you have your through line. And your video does a great job of kind of going back and saying like, no, this is a guy who is exploring himself, his contradictions, how he changes his mind, is thinking about his audience and how they respond to whether, you know, Last Temptation of Christ or whatever, and trying to think through what worked, what didn't work, approaching things from new angles. In that sense, your video is such an achievement in the way that it does that. And I'm wondering how do you strike that balance between, you know, like when I imagine you sitting at your computer to make this, I get overwhelmed because I'm like, how did he tie so many films together to do this, right? So how do you strike that balance between like not overwhelming the viewer and not trying to throw too much in there, but also keeping that through line that you do establish of like, this is something that goes from, you know, the Harvey Keitel days up through, you know, the Irishman or what have you.
Well, I was also overwhelmed, which is why I procrastinated for like a year on making this video. And yeah, the hard thing, one of the harder parts about this video was just like this, like at a certain point I just had to say, okay, I'm done. Like this, I'm cutting you off. Like this is where we have to stop. I can't also include, you know, Bringing Out the Dead. I can't also like go do a deep dive into like, you know, 5 other films that these themes are central to. So yeah, it was definitely a unique challenge. I think in terms of striking that balance, I tried to keep only the examples that I felt were like necessary to making my argument. Part of this comes from like, at least for this specific video, I wrote out like a script that was based on the research that I'd done, all the films that I had looked at, and the notes I had taken on them, I had a script that kind of laid out like, here's the arc, here's the argument that I'm trying to make, or like, you know, what I'm trying to convey about Scorsese and religion. And then my process is kind of to like pull out statements that I'm making and replace that with an example that would make that same point. And so there's a argument that's constructed that has like a logical through line, and then I just kind of swap out maybe pieces of that argument instead of saying this, let me just show you, you know, this bit from, you know, Mean Streets or whatever. And that, I think, makes my point. And then, you know, just having faith that like my audience is going to be able to like put those pieces together and you know, finish the puzzle. I think, you know, maybe sometimes there may be moments where like I overestimate my audience's ability to do that, and maybe some people are left behind in that, but I think it's more rewarding to leave those connections to people. And also it's like I know my ability over broad spans of time to like gather this bit of information and this bit of information and like see the through line across that. And so if I was able to do it over the course of like a year, I'm hoping that if I condense all those elements into like 20 minutes, that people will hopefully be able to follow sort of the path that I went on, you know, over the course of those 20 minutes. But it's one of the things, it's also, I think it's one of the things that I love about this form, and we'll get in it too later when we're talking about the video that I chose for us to talk about. I've been very influenced since I started doing video essays by documentary filmmakers who work without language, some of the older Soviet filmmakers, or documentaries like Koyaanisqatsi or that type of thing, where it's just like pure image and just the context of one image against another. And I really love that idea and the power of just like putting two things side by side and just letting sort of the audience infer from that what they will, you know, and if that means they don't even come to the same conclusions that I did, then I'm like, great, you know, that's also part of the process. But just being able to like recontextualize things and place two things side by side sometimes I think is enough. And yeah, so in terms of how to balance that, I don't know. I tend to lean towards, you know, being a little more fearless and, you know, risking kind of leaving some things unsaid for the benefit of you know, allowing people to sort of put those pieces together on their own.
I love that. And I think so much of what you said just gets to the heart of why so many people love this kind of work and are excited by it and are really trying to think through what it looks like, what we're doing with it. And I think we talk about kind of these two poles of video essay, where kind of the poetic and the explanatory. And I think what's so interesting about your videos, and part of the reason why I love them so much, is because I'm definitely someone who, if I had to pick one, I would say if I had to watch one for the rest of my life, it would be more poetic videos. And not to say that they're better than explanatory, they're just different. But I think we come to associate a lot of YouTube videos with that kind of more explanatory, which is fine. That's great. But I think for you, everything that you're saying, thinking about it retroactively, is what I feel in your work, is that you kind of dip in and out of these two areas. And it's very interesting to see how you're kind of thinking about it and where you want to go. How do you think about this? Perhaps relates to another question that I was going to ask you, but if they don't relate, feel free to build on what I just said and then we can go elsewhere. But one thing I was thinking about as I was watching your videos was this video in particular, was you tended to perhaps explain or add more to a film that maybe fewer people have seen than another Scorsese film. For example, I think I noticed that maybe you didn't provide as much context to Goodfellas as maybe you did to Cape Fear. And obviously, like, comparatively, a lot of people have seen both of those movies. But I would say if you were to pull one or the other, a lot more people have probably seen Goodfellas, and or people who have seen neither probably at least know what Goodfellas is about. So is that something you're thinking about, like the audience's familiarity with the image that you're working with?
Yeah. I kind of think you have to, like, if you're not, you're not seeing the image as it really is, which is like the audience's familiarity to it affects how they see it. Like there's clips from Goodfellas that are like memes or like, they're like tropes almost. And so the audience's reaction to that or their relationship to that is going to be very different from something they've maybe never seen before, or maybe they saw it once a long time ago and, it didn't really stick in their mind because it's not part of like, this cultural thing in the same way. So yeah, that's definitely something I try to take into account. Often it's kind of instinctual. I'm not thinking about it like super explicitly. I just know that like, if I'm going into this film, I'm probably that a lot, fewer people have seen, I'm probably going to have to provide more context. That's part of the process, I guess, of like some of, video essay for a more popular audience is just like knowing you can never remove yourself from the fact that like you're making this for a group of people that, they aren't academic. They're not going to go read the sources. They're not going to, maybe some of them would, but mostly it's like they're clicking on a video and just watching it. And, maybe they have seen. What amazes me is the amount of comments I get from people who like watch a video and they're like, oh, like on this video that we're talking about, for example, there was a decent amount of people who were like, oh yeah, I saw like one Scorsese video, and they're like, maybe I should go watch more of the Scorsese guy. And I'm like, it kind of blows my mind that there are people who maybe only seen Goodfellas or whatever who are watching that like entire video and care about it. But that happens more often than you would think. And if I look at my own experience, a lot of times I watch video essays about stuff I've never seen. And that's often how I'll discover interesting things. So I try to keep that context in mind that like, people, but there's also always a balance there because I don't want to just be like, now let me explain the plot of this film to you because, I try not to do that unless the explanation itself is part of like, I'm trying to say about the thing. So yeah, it's tricky when you're making something for an audience that's very amorphous and unknowable. But
I do think we need to remember, as you say, that there are a lot of people, particularly younger people, who are just overwhelmed with content right now, who have access to. I'm in my mid-20s, and they even have more access, like exponentially more access than I did when I was, 10 years ago or what have you. And I think also when we talk about the poetic side, and this isn't always true, but I think it is, for me, it's something I think about, that if I actually use, something that I know more people are familiar with, the more I can do with it, the more I can break it, the more I can like shock you with it, the more I can, really mess around, which, it might be true that I could do that with a more obscure film, but I think that does have something to do with it.
There's definitely a difference between like taking something somebody hasn't seen and doing something with that or expositing that in a certain way, and then like taking something somebody has seen or is even maybe very familiar with, and then like recontextualizing that. Like those are kind of two different modes, and the fun thing is like you can do like both of those things in the same work and like interrelate them. And I could nerd out about this stuff, because if you start thinking about those elements of the form and like what's possible, it's like infinite. There's like incredible complexity that can be uncovered or utilized, and that's this weird space that this form of videographic criticism exists in, which is like you're talking about media, but it is the same type. It's almost the same type of media that you're talking about. And so in the same way that like, I'm talking about all these tools that filmmakers have at their disposal through visual, film grammar and all these techniques that they're using to communicate what they want to communicate, simultaneously, those same kinds of tools are like available to me in this work to communicate my ideas or to try to, to reframe their ideas in a different way. And yeah, so I think I love that about it.
Right. And to your point, I think there is this kind of, this is something we've talked about on the show, and I really enjoyed talking about this with Nelson Carval, who I actually see some similarities between kind of some of the things you're talking about in your work and the work that he does as far as like thinking about responding to things as they happen and making videos. But we were just talking about how in many ways this allows us in a very democratic way to kind of reclaim a lot of these movies from corporations and to really have an ownership stake in them, and that inherently makes a difference. So I feel much different like remixing a film that like is owned by a huge corporation, maybe like an independent film that the filmmaker just uploaded to Vimeo and stuff. Like there's all these different ethical questions that we don't need to get into now that are worth considering. And so I think that's a crucial factor. But I want to jump back to something that you mentioned earlier, just this kind of question of citations and things like that. So we, in a conversation with Allison Dufresne and Tracy Cox Stanton on the show, couldn't even tell you how long ago it was. I think it was earlier this year. We talked, they had edited an issue of a journal called The Cinephiles that was dedicated to the discussion of what is the scholarly video essay, like what is a piece of scholarship. And one of the key factors is like thinking about citations. And that's not to say that scholarly video essays are good and non-scholarly video essays are bad. And I think the point Tracy made was that like there are no citations in The New Yorker, for example, right? But The New Yorker certainly is not bad, right? Like it's just something different. And so, YouTube video essays, though, there are often citations or links to sources and stuff like this. So I'm wondering, what is your, like, when you made this video, what was your research process like? Like, what do you turn to as far as materials in your work?
A lot of times, and because I didn't come from an academic background at all, and I'm not thinking about my work as within the context of like a larger conversation. And there's people who step into that form more so on YouTube, and I think more power to them, and that's great as well. Like because videographic criticism on YouTube, even its more populist form, is like also this conversational, ongoing work. So your work is never removed completely from the context of like conversation, but that's not formalized. And so I don't often, if I'm being honest, I'm not often thinking about like, what is this video's place within like the larger discussion about Martin Scorsese or something like that. And even in researching this video, like there's some pretty extensive like scholarly research that's been done on Scorsese's relationship to religion. And I didn't really touch a lot of that because what I was looking at doing was talking about not like what has the conversation about Scorsese and religion been, but like let me paint a portrait for my audience, who I think are probably people who have just watched a few Scorsese movies and then probably never really thought about what he is, his project or the ideas he's exploring on this like broader context throughout his life. My goal was like, let me paint a portrait for those people of Scorsese's himself, his relationship to these things. And so a lot of the research I was going to was like interviews with him, commentaries on his films that I could find. And then any writing from critics specifically, maybe that people had done about his relationship, more populist writing about religion in his work, just to kind of get a sense of maybe what was out there. Sometimes I'll try to like take the temperature and get a sense of like where my ideas are within just like the broader landscape of the discussion. But most often my focus is on like, what can I show people using the text itself, and kind of just allowing, these examples like from the text that I can line up. My goal with this video was like, if I could just say nothing and just line up like 10 different clips from a Scorsese movie, and then like you got all the same information or from different Scorsese movies, and you somehow could like realize the same things and come to the same conclusions, that's like the ideal video for me. And so in some ways that's very removed from it, like trying to contextualize what you're saying within any kind of broader conversation. It's just just recontextualizing the text, it's the work itself that you're looking at, by like juxtaposing it against itself. Obviously, I'm writing a script and doing voiceover and things, but I think of that as like trying to hold people's hand through, the stepping stones of the different moments that I'm trying to connect. So I don't know, but that's my approach. I don't have any like, I probably should have a little bit more involvement in like placing my work within a broader conversation, and then trying to cite that and give people, stepping stones from where they could like trace things back or continue that. But most of the time, I'm trying to get as pure an interaction between like my response to the work and the work's sort of relationship to itself, and then if I'm going to a third-party source, most often that's just going to be like the filmmaker talking about their work, and then I'll try to, whenever I use like interview clips or something like that, I'll cite that.
One thing that I appreciate about this video and your work in general in relation to this whole conversation is that there was never a point in the video where you're like, guys, guess what? I just found this incredible discovery and I'm the first person to think of this. Like, religion is important to Martin Scorsese. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
Yes.
I think it's all like, I think you do a good job there. And I think it's a good lesson for people out there who want to maybe make a video similar to this one, is that you don't, as long as you establish that parameter, you can then go from wherever you want to go. And you clearly do that in the video. Like, as I was watching, I was like, okay, this makes sense. Just as if you were commissioned to write an article about this for a magazine, you wouldn't spend, like a scholarly article would spend like, or like a scholarly book or whatever might spend like pages and pages going over what's already out there and contextualizing it. But you don't have that room in the New Yorker. So you just kind of have to go into it and not make any claims to like being some genius that like just pulled all these pieces together. So I think context is everything, and how you frame it is important.
And they have different, the different modes of work have different, utilities. If I had to do a lot of those things in the videos that I was doing and, cite all the background and then, contextualize everything, people would be gone in the first, couple minutes of the video. So there's sort of the space, the context, the medium is the message, the YouTube, and like doing this for YouTube and in a more populous space definitely defines to an extent the way you have to go about doing it. That's not to say, like we already mentioned, there's YouTubers who are pretty rigorous in like how they do their research and cite their sources and stuff. But within the actual video itself, I think the form kind of boxes you in a little bit more, or the platform, I should say.
Yeah, and it sounds to me that you, and I think this is true for a lot of people, is that your hope when they finish the video is not that they walk away thinking, well, I know everything about Martin Scorsese and religion now. Like, see, it's I've just piqued your interest. I've given you a baseline. Now go watch, go figure it out and do that on your own. And that's what I love about this forum, is it always feels to me like a conversation, either starter or the continuing of a conversation. It's never the end of one,
And it's like, in some ways it's just who I am, and an acknowledgement of like what I'm actually doing, which is that I'm not an academic. I'm not a film scholar. I'm not even a film critic. I'm a guy, who was into filmmaking and who likes watching movies. And so I watch a bunch of them and then I'm like, this is what I think. And when I put this bit and this bit side by side, it looks like these things, and so there's a way in which I'm hoping through my work to encourage other people, even if they're not making video essays or whatever, that they can just like gain a better understanding of these pieces of media by just like thinking about these things and trying to contextualize what they're watching and the media they're consuming within this like broader context.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's a great transition to talking about Jacob's video essay, because some of what you just said before we got the microphones rolling, we had kind of started talking about this very subject in relation to Jacob's essay. So would you mind just introducing, this is the segment where you've selected this video for us to talk about. I'd never seen it before. Very grateful that you introduced me to it because it's fantastic. So tell us the video, who created it and picked it for us to discuss today. And again, the idea here being, maybe if you have time, pause now, go watch it, come back later, what have you. But if not, we'll keep that in mind that maybe some people have not. So the floor is yours.
So the video I selected is titled "The Game That Won't Let You See All of It" by Jacob Geller. Jacob does phenomenal work, mostly in the space of talking about video games, video game design, but he often brings other mediums into that space and kind of relates them. And also one of the reasons I chose this is a lot of his work is really compelling, even if you are not that into video games or have never touched the game that he's talking about. He often does a really good job of sort of contextualizing that game or talking about that game in a way that doesn't require that you've played it. And that's really, we'll start there as that being one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, because one of the things that I'm really interested in one of the things that excites me about the video essay form is this idea that you can take other pieces of media, and what Jacob is doing in this video is he's not just talking about this game, which has a really unique function of you control it. You use your webcam and your blinks to control your movement through the game. He's not just talking about the game itself, but he uses the material of that game and the material of several other a couple films, the Before trilogy by Richard Linklater, the film Boyhood, and the Up series, which is a British documentary series. He relates all those things together and some footage that he's shot in his life to create a work that in and of itself is an exploration of the themes that he feels the game is talking about. So he's taking, these materials, and then he's synthesizing an experience that you just watching that video, even if you had none of the context of watching any of the things or playing the game or watching any of the things that he talks about, still for me, because I never played the game when I watched the video, synthesize this experience of oh, I'm thinking about time, which is what the game and the subject that he's talking about. I'm thinking about those things now. Now, it's raising certain questions in my mind or feelings or emotions. And those are the feelings and the emotions and the ideas that the game brought to the surface for him. So there's almost this really tactile element to the form where you're actually invoking in your audience. For Jacob, he's actually invoking in his audience the feelings that he's trying to talk about that the game invoked in him.
No, I think that's well said. And I was thinking some of the same things when I was watching it. So the video game he looks at is Before Your Eyes. And like Thomas said, essentially you play the game with your webcam turned on, and there's some type of face recognition technology or AI, or I'm not quite sure what it's exactly called, that it basically, you're playing the game and there's a story and it's playing out. And I think whenever you blink, I've also not played it, so I only know this through Jacob's video, the game essentially fasts forwards, and you go through time, and so it all depends on when you blink. So that's kind of where the title of it, comes, not being able to see the whole game. But in Jacob's video, there are points where he's, as Thomas said, he's tying all these things together. He's tying the game, the Linklater films, Up, a montage of he did one of those videos where he shot a second of his life every day for years, and there's portions of that in it. So it's all about the passage of time, and the way he kind of, they all flow together, but he doesn't blend them all into one narrative. There's certain segments in the video that he connects by simulating the blink of the game, and it will kind of go blink, and there's this little metronome at the bottom, and then it transitions to something else. And so it's this really interesting blend, I think, of form and content, allowing the style of the thing that you're working with to inform your narrative and your criticism of it, which is really brilliantly done. I was kind of blown away by it. It's a really genius way to structure it. I can see you nodding. Yeah.
No, I'm such a sucker for that idea of like using like the form to like talk about the form. Like and that's what he's doing in this video. Like he's emulating parts of what the game is doing, as you said. And talking about this video, I didn't really do this intentionally, but talking about this video also ties really well into something we were talking about earlier with my Scorsese video, which is like Jacob's work specifically. He does it in a especially like jarring and fragmented way with this video, where he's kind of like jumping from this example to this example, and you're not sure at first. He'll like start talking about something and then it kind of cuts off, and then he starts about something else, and he gets maybe like 3 threads going, and at first you're maybe like not quite sure exactly how those things are really going to relate to each other. But then by the end of the video, you're like, oh yeah, I do see how, Metal Gear Solid and this game and Boyhood are all connected somehow. But he does that in a softer way throughout a lot of his work. And he was definitely one of the essayists who influenced me to like be a little bit more bold with how I just like, here's an example that you maybe aren't sure quite yet how those things relate, but we'll get there. Like eventually it's going to come together, hopefully through, building up these pieces. And I think that's a really fun like journey you can take people on too, which is like, it almost builds suspense where you're like, okay, it's like intercutting in a film or something like that. It's like, why are we seeing both of these things at once? And you just sort of have to wait and, trust that the storyteller is going to like bring those pieces together.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And to that exact point. So the first time, no, spoiler alert, the first time in the video that like the blink happens, it cuts him off like it might even be mid word. Like it was such an abrupt cut. I thought like something went, I swear to God, I thought something went wrong with my AirPods. So I rewinded it like 10 seconds. So I was like, okay, and then I was like, wait, did he just like edit it? I was like, I've seen this stuff before. I was like, that's not like him to like have this like sloppy edit. So I was like, okay, like let me like just keep going. And then I was like, okay, like now I get it. And I think it's such a great example of, in that sense, I'm not a huge video game player. I used to be more. I'm wanting to get back into it. And maybe this video essay will help me do that. I recently reactivated my Steam account. And if you follow me on Twitter, I just got a new computer. So I'm like, send me your game recommendations, everybody listening. I'm ready to go. I just need some encouragement from people out there. So send me game recommendations. But anyway, in a sense, like, yeah, it emulates the process of playing the game in that way. And I also think like for a lot of video games itself, and this video game in particular, you're often just kind of thrown into situations, and then you kind of have to like figure it out as you're going. Like the game I'm actually playing now is I like bought the original BioShock game for really cheap on Steam, and I've been like playing. I'm terrible at it. Like I'm so bad at it, and I'm having a fun time doing it. And like that's a game where I'm like trying to figure something out, and it kind of seems like that's such an there might be examples of video essays about film and TV that do something similar, but it's not quite the same because that seems like to be such a unique experience to the video game. Like in a video essay about Hitchcock, I might try to emulate the horror or the shock of it, but this seems to be trying to emulate the experience of video game, which is so interesting because it's obviously not a video game, Yeah, he's moving across forms, but somehow like relating those two forms together as best he can, which is, it's a pretty, I don't know. I loved it. I'm wondering, I was very excited when you selected this video because I think I've been wanting to, there's a lot of ways that this podcast can grow because there's so many amazing things out there that people are doing. And one of them is video essays. And we've touched on them a little bit in the past, as early as like when we had Grace Lee on, who has made great videos about video games. But you mentioned that you weren't much of a gamer yourself, but that you often enjoy video essays about video games. So my question is, why in your view, why? No, but, kind of, but like, why in your view would you? Yeah, I think I know the answer to this. A, because we talked about it, and B, because I have my own thoughts. But why would someone who's not into video games or is not a video gamer, why should they watch video essays about video games? Like, what do you take away from it personally, and what would be your recommendation to other people?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, like when it comes to Jacob Geller's work, like I mentioned with this video, I think he's creating enough of an experience just using the games as material that often like the videos in and of themselves are just entertaining and thought-provoking enough that I don't remember how I stumbled across them in the first place because I don't really seek out video game related content. But once I saw what he was doing, I was like, oh, I'm definitely interested in checking these out, even though this isn't necessarily a subject that I'm interested in, because he's using that material to tell his own stories, and I'm just interested in those stories, kind of regardless of the material that he's using. But there's also an element, like if you're interested in this form, there's also definitely an element of I think it's really valuable to learn. It's a really valuable way to learn about the potential of the form by examining how it's used for media that maybe you're not working in. Or how it's being used to examine things that you haven't seen, and understanding that context of like, what is the experience like of watching somebody talk about something that like I have almost no interest in, and how do they actually engage me in that experience, despite the fact that I haven't engaged with that media. Yeah, I think it's really valuable. It's a really valuable way to learn about the form for people who are just interested in the form in general. But then also, I think it also shows us the potential of the form as just its own form of either entertainment or storytelling or, thought-provoking media, even when it's removed from, your own relationship maybe to the media that's being talked about.
I think that's wonderfully put. And I think just using this as an example, like it's just this interesting domino effect where you have this idea of this game using this technology, and this feels innovative to me way with the blinking, and then the blinking, it makes its way into the form of Jacob's video. And now I'm already starting to think about how could I use a similar tactic in a video about cinema, or, and so it has this interesting thing. And I also think, getting back to, and maybe this is like kind of a depressing way to put this, and I'm just giving into like capitalism or whatever, but I feel like I'll never get a chance to play a lot of video games just because I don't have that, just because I'm watching movies or doing you can only devote yourself to a few types of media. I mean, some people are really good at balancing it, but I just don't. It's just not me. I wish I could. If I made it clear, I'm an aspiring gamer, so I'm willing to change. I'm willing to learn the ways of the game. I love it. I read a lot of articles about video games. I watch videos about them because it's something I'm interested in, something that I like to keep up with, but I can't. I'm one day. And so I think this,
but yeah. You can't dedicate yourself to that medium with the same depth. I mean, this is something, the more and more I learned about film, the more it's made me appreciate other mediums, because I'm the depth that exists here in film that I'm just now, after, really starting to try to study it for, a decade or whatever, the depth that I'm now starting to uncover and see here, I now know exists in every other space, but I'm just I'm never going to have, I don't have, I barely have the time to do it with film, much less, and get in a picture and an understanding of that media, much less countless others, video games, literature, all these other things. And so there's a beauty of an essayist or, somebody being able to be here, let me show you a little bit of the joy or what's unique about this medium, or let me help you, let me dive deeply into that space and be fully immersed in it, and then bring back for you a little piece of what it's like to really appreciate how genius this medium can be. So yeah, I think there's a beauty to that, of being able to explore the depths of other mediums that you'll never, maybe be able to have a full appreciation for otherwise through other people's video essays. And the form is really good at doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in as it relates to video games in particular, you can go on YouTube and find thousands of hours of videos of like gameplay footage of people playing certain levels, blah, blah. And that can give you a sense of what the game is, what it looks like, what it feels like, maybe what it's like to play it. But to your point, like in this form itself, I actually feel like I have more of it's more effective. It's more like I actually feel like I have like kind of now have a relationship to this game or an understanding of a facet of it that I don't think I would get just from watching gameplay footage. Like it's the closest thing that I could probably get to playing it through myself, which like if I'm being honest with myself, like I will probably never do. Maybe I will, but it's not likely. And maybe that's also okay. And maybe the same thing, maybe someone who's really into video games feels the same way about cinema. Like maybe they're like, okay, there's this film from the 40s that I've never seen, but I watched this really great video essay on it and I got something from it, and that's enough for me. And I see downsides to there are trade-offs either way, downsides to both, but I think there's good things to that too. It's better than nothing, I guess, right?
In a sense, Jacob's video that we're talking about here it's about the game before your eyes, but that's not what it's really about at its core. At its core, this video essay is about Jacob's experience playing that game, and he really unravels. Like he's taking us like, this game made me think about Boyhood, and this game made me think about the Up series, and it made me think about these movies that I've watched and these videos that I shot, and all these like emotions and time. And he really brings you inside his experience of what it was like to play that game. And people do that, like you said. I think one of the great examples in the film realm is like sometimes I'll watch a video. There's a movie I've watched and I'm like, I watched the movie and I'm like, fine, I didn't get anything out of it. I didn't enjoy it or whatever. And then I'll watch somebody's video essay and it's like Tom from Like Stories of Old has a video about Hacksaw Ridge that's like this, where it's like that movie I watched and I was like, okay, fine, I move on, whatever. And then I watched his video and I was like, this video is better than the movie. Like I had a better experience watching his video about it than I did watching the movie, because like he brought me inside his experience of watching that movie and what it was like for him and what he experienced. And in his video essay, took me on that journey. And ironically, like, at least for me personally, like did a better job of involving me in that emotional experience in his video than the actual movie had. But that just like reveals the potential of the form here to like, involve you in an experience, not just to exposit, but like actually tell you a story and involve you in that story in the same way that film does.
I'm reminded of something that I meant to say earlier in our conversation when you mentioned kind of your relationship with David Lynch and making video essays, and that is just, this stuff is just so subjective in a really beautiful way. And that's not to say that, I mean, there are incredible video essays out there about David Lynch. Like when we say that there are directors, that's not saying that no one can make good video essays about David Lynch, but for you and your relationship to it, you can't. And I think the same thing applies to viewing. Like, you watch a film and you just can't have a relationship to it that someone else can. And so the video essay is a great way for you to like have that new experience. And I think that's so wonderful. And I think it's really changed the way that I think about like spectatorship. Like I sometimes write film reviews and stuff, but I'm really not interested in being like a film critic. I don't know if I could, because I'm really not interested in like writing about like a bad movie or like trashing a movie. Like unless I find it like morally reprehensible for whatever reason. But if it's like people put a lot of work into that, like, I appreciate people who do it, I guess, but it's just not for me. Like I'm just like, it doesn't like get me out of bed in the morning. Like I'd much rather write about something that I love and care about. And so I think this forum has like really, really reinforced that. Like that's the best stuff. And sometimes those are the video essays I like the most, where I'm like, oh yeah, like dude, you're really into this movie that I think sucks. Like tell me about it. Like tell me why it's good. Like change my mind. It's so great. Yeah.
That what you just said reminded me of exactly what I wanted to say, which is I often get asked by people in comments or my audience, what is how do you know you're not over analyzing things, or what is over analysis? And this idea, when I think about it, ties into also kind of my personal framework for how I think about like good and bad criticism or analysis, which is that like most of the time, I mean, sometimes you're delving into historical and social context and you're doing this research that's like trying to place something within this much broader context. And those elements definitely play into it. But a lot of the time, or like the technical elements of something, like here's how this was done technically, the actual cameras that was used or how they're doing this technique or something. But a lot of times when it comes to like theme and meaning and feeling, I'm like, all I'm trying to do is feel what my experience was and then convey that to other people honestly. And I think a lot of times, quote unquote, over analysis comes from this idea of like, oh, I need something to say. And so I'm just going to rummage around until I find it and then, put some things out there. And it's like, if you do that, what you end up saying is going to feel like over analysis because it's not coming from this true internal experience. And so I think there's something that's very great about like just taking an experience that you had with a piece of media and being able to like convey that to other people, or kind of dig deeper into like the next step then is like, well, why, for me, often it's looking at that and then thinking about like, well, why did it have that effect on me? Like, this is the effect it had on me. Why did it have, and trying to like reverse engineer that. And then that's what, the video ends up being. But just having an honesty in that like subjectivity, because you really can't, I think you really can't remove that element of like, your own subjectivity and how you're approaching the work and how you're talking about it. So just being as honest to that as possible, I think is like one of the best ways to pursue this kind of work.
I think that's an invaluable piece of advice. I couldn't agree more. And I also think that's a great way to end our conversation. Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Will. This has been great.